My name is Matteo Bellini, a 38-year-old journalist with a background in theology and a growing unease about the spiritual direction of the world. I never expected that my most significant investigation wouldn't be into some political scandal or corporate conspiracy, but into a silent spiritual earthquake hidden within the polished corridors of the Vatican. What happened on May 30th, 2025, shook me to my core, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. That was the day Bishop Calogero Martinez, a widely respected and long-serving figure in the Diocese of Newark, was suddenly removed from his position by Pope Leo XIV with no explanation. There was no press conference, no pastoral farewell, no public thank you for years of service. Just a quiet insertion of a new name on the Vatican's website, as if someone had edited a document and forgotten to mention it to the rest of the world. It began as a hunch. I was attending a conference in New York on Catholic engagement in urban communities, a rather dry subject, when I overheard two priests whispering behind me. One said, "They've already taken Calogero out." No one expected it. Not even him. The tone was urgent, hushed, like something far deeper lay under the surface. I leaned back slightly, straining to hear more, but their conversation ended as soon as they noticed me. Something about their expressions haunted me. They weren't just surprised, they were afraid. I made a few discreet calls that evening, starting with a former seminary classmate of mine who now served as a diocesan administrator in New Jersey. "Off the record?" he asked. I nodded into the phone. They told him 2 hours before it went public. 2 hours. That's unheard of, Matteo. Usually, bishops get months of prep, time to organize farewell liturgies, write letters to the faithful. He got none of that. Just a sealed letter delivered through a courier in black. The Vatican seal, he told me, wasn't broken until Bishop Calogero opened it in his private chapel. According to my source, the bishop wept upon reading it. Then he simply stood up, handed the letter to his secretary, and left the rectory for the final time without a word. What could possibly justify such abruptness? Bishop Calogero had been controversial to some, particularly traditionalists, but he was beloved by many in Newark's working-class Catholic population. He had championed outreach to the homeless, immigrant communities, and even launched a now notorious diocesan initiative aimed at welcoming LGBTQ individuals back into the life of the Church. He used the phrase radical inclusion in several homilies, a term that many Vatican watchers believe was too loaded to be accidental. He refused to endorse certain Vatican documents on liturgical norms and had reportedly clashed, in private, with a visiting nuncio over excessive rigidity in doctrine. But all of that still didn't feel like enough to explain the Vatican's silent treatment. It felt surgical, clinical, executed with a kind of precision that didn't suggest offense, it suggested strategy. 3 days later, I flew to Rome on a hunch and called in a favor from a Jesuit friend who worked inside the Vatican archives. We met at an old cafe just outside the walls. He looked pale, like someone carrying a truth too heavy for one soul. "There's something coming," he said without prompting. "Pope Leo isn't just replacing bishops, he's repositioning the Church. Something prophetic. Apocalyptic even." I raised an eyebrow. "You're not one for drama, Paolo." He sipped his espresso slowly, eyes darting left and right. "I've seen the list. Bishop Calogero was only the first. There are at least 9 more already written in red ink. Dioceses across Europe, Latin America, and even Asia. The Pope calls it his purification wave. He believes the Church has absorbed too much of the world, and it's time to shake her from sleep. That word stayed with me, purification. Not reform. Not restructuring. It felt ancient. Biblical. Like something pulled from Revelation rather than canon law. Later that week, the new bishop was installed in Newark without fanfare. His name was Monsignor Lucien Grimaldi, and almost no one had heard of him outside a small circle of clerics in Rome. He had never led a diocese, but he had been rector of a seminary in southern Italy known for its strict orthodoxy and mystical culture. Rumors surrounded his time there, visions of angels during Mass, exorcisms in hidden chapels, and published essays warning of digital liturgical corruption. I had read one of them years ago in an obscure theological journal, where he warned that the Church is being hollowed out by a theology of comfort disguised as compassion. No formal statement was issued from the Vatican. None from the Diocese of Newark either. I visited the cathedral a week later. The mood was subdued, as if the congregation had been collectively scolded. The stained glass windows seemed dimmer than I remembered. A woman lighting candles at the side altar caught my eye. She wore a thick black veil and muttered what I thought was a prayer, but when I drew close, I realized she was repeating the same phrase under her breath. He came like a thief in the night, a thief in the night. It sent a chill down my spine. I returned home to Boston and began compiling everything: names, dates, statements, deleted Vatican web pages, flight logs of nuncios. What emerged was a strange pattern: bishops being removed or silenced in areas where progressive reforms had advanced most rapidly. But even more troubling was the replacement pattern: young, conservative, spiritually intense men with obscure paper trails and deep loyalty to the Pope's inner circle. They weren't just bishops, they were soldiers. That's when I stumbled upon something truly unsettling: an unlisted internal memo from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. It was sent 2 months before Calogero's removal. The subject line: Eucharistic integrity in doctrinally compromised regions. The body of the message referred to a 3-phase renewal strategy, beginning with removal of spiritually destabilizing shepherds. I knew immediately what that meant. The memo didn't name names, but the regions mentioned matched perfectly with those under scrutiny: Newark, Cologne, Sao Paulo, Melbourne. I found myself praying again at night, something I hadn't done in years. Not out of devotion, but out of dread. What did Pope Leo know that the rest of us didn't? And more importantly, what was coming? I returned to Rome again in early June, this time with a press badge for a Vatican press conference. After the event ended, I slipped away into the Apostolic Palace courtyard, hoping to catch someone I could question. That's when I was approached by a tall Swiss guard, his eyes locked on mine with eerie intensity. "You're Matteo Bellini," he said, not asked. I nodded, heart pounding. He leaned in and said softly, "He removed Calogero because Calogero knew." "Knew what?" I whispered. He glanced toward the shadows behind him. "That the Church has already been infiltrated. That the next war won't be in the pews, it'll be in the sanctuary. And only those who fear God more than man will survive it." He turned and walked away before I could ask another word. That night, I lay awake in my Rome apartment, watching candlelight flicker across my notebook. Something deep inside me knew this wasn't just about one bishop or one diocese. This was something cosmic, something ancient, the kind of realignment that doesn't happen often in history, one that divides the church like wheat from chaff. And I, for reasons I didn't yet understand, had been allowed to see the first ripple of the coming storm. The first true crack in my certainty came not from a headline or a confidential Vatican memo, but from a nightmare. I had returned to Boston following my second trip to Rome, and though I was trying to live normally again, writing short political columns for the paper, attending Mass as a silent observer, walking the Charles River each morning, I was no longer the same man. Something had shifted in me after that encounter with the Swiss guard. The way he said, "The war won't be in the pews, it'll be in the sanctuary," echoed in my chest like a bell that refused to stop ringing. The dream came 3 nights in a row, unchanged. I stood outside a cathedral, but it was burning from the inside. Not from fire, there were no flames, but from a kind of golden light that pulsed from within, growing brighter and more violent until the stained glass exploded outward like shrapnel. And always, behind me in the dream, I would hear singing. Children's voices. Innocent, melodic, but dissonant, as though something evil had taken hold of their purity. When I shared the dream with my spiritual director, an elderly Jesuit named Father Raymond whom I trusted, he didn't offer interpretation. He only said, "The Spirit is stirring, Matteo." And when that happens, the veil between this world and what lies beneath it begins to thin. I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was trying to reach me. Not just intellectually, but spiritually. I began fasting, praying again, not for comfort, but for clarity. And it was then, in that state of soul-emptying hunger, that I received the email. The subject line read, "Ad Dominum." There was no sender name. Just a secure Proton Mail account with an encrypted message body. It contained a single link to a password-protected server and the passphrase, "Et filii in tenebris lucet." The sons in darkness shall shine. Against every rational instinct, I clicked the link. What opened before me was a cache of files, PDFs, memos, scans of handwritten notes, video clips, some grainy and corrupted, others crisp and date-stamped with Vatican letterhead. But it was the first file that caught my eye. It was titled, Project Revventter, Internal Ecclesial Strategy for Sacred Containment. As I read through the document, my breath caught in my throat. According to the memo, Revventter was the code name for an initiative being quietly enacted under Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. Its purpose was clear and terrifying: to identify, isolate, and remove clergy believed to be under spiritual influence, either willingly or unknowingly, of forces contrary to divine orthodoxy. It referenced not only doctrinal deviations, but also liturgical energy distortions, unauthorized mystical experiences, and high incidence of Eucharistic desecration. I read that phrase 3 times, liturgical energy distortions. These weren't theological terms. These were metaphysical, almost occult. But the document bore the signatures of real cardinals, men I had met or interviewed in past years. One file included a table of metrics tracking diocesan behaviors across the world: decline in Eucharistic reverence, increase in non-confession before communion, frequency of homilies referencing inclusivity, universalism, or interfaith convergence. The last column was labeled miasmic threshold exceeded, with a binary yes or a no. Newark had a yes. So did Brussels, Sao Paulo, Melbourne. I was shaking. This wasn't reform. This was a spiritual triage. A Vatican-led classification of dioceses infected with what they were calling subtle spiritual corruption. And Bishop Calogero? His profile was listed under a section titled, Obstructing Shepherds, High Risk of Resistance to Sacred Containment. It all started to make sense. But it also raised deeper questions, ones I was afraid to answer. What exactly did they believe was being contained? And why was silence their primary weapon? I had to find Bishop Calogero. Rumor had placed him somewhere in Sicily, in a Carmelite monastery nestled in the hills outside Enna. I flew to Italy the next day and drove through the narrow, winding mountain roads until I found the monastery, a centuries-old stone compound veiled in fog and prayer. No one greeted me at the gate. I left a note with the porter and returned the next morning. That time, they let me in. I was led to a simple garden courtyard where he sat on a stone bench beneath a fig tree, looking frail but alert. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a cup of tea. When he saw me, he smiled, not with joy, but with a kind of wounded recognition. "You found me," he said softly. "I was wondering when someone would." We spoke for over an hour. He was careful with his words, but what he revealed changed everything. He had not been accused of heresy. There had been no canonical process, no formal complaint. Instead, he said, he had been summoned to Rome privately weeks before his removal and interviewed by 3 cardinals and a Dominican theologian. "They didn't ask me what I believed," he said. "They asked me what I had seen. At first, I didn't understand. But then," he clarified, "visions, apparitions, manifestations during consecration. I saw angels at the altar," he said with tears in his eyes. "Not in every Mass, but often enough to know they weren't figments. I saw the host bleed once, not metaphorically, Matteo. Literally. I saw the tabernacle glow with light that had no earthly source. And that, apparently, was the problem." He had reported these events to the Congregation for Divine Worship. Instead of celebrating the miracle, they responded with concern. Accusations of hallucination. Or worse, spiritual infiltration. They feared what I had seen, he said, because it confirmed the truth they tried to keep hidden, that the sanctuary is under siege, and that not all priests are who they appear to be. He paused and then added, almost in a whisper, "Some of them aren't even men anymore. They were flesh, yes, but not the way you and I do." I shuddered. He handed me a small envelope before I left. Inside was a photograph, grainy and yellowing, of what appeared to be a Eucharistic procession from decades ago. But in the background, in the shadows of the church's interior, there were 2 figures watching, clad in cassocks. But their faces, they were wrong. Blurred. Twisted. Too long. Too smooth. "You'll see more of them soon," he said. "Watch the sanctuaries. Especially when the incense falls heavy." When I returned to Boston, I was no longer just investigating a bishop's removal. I was walking the line between journalism and spiritual warfare. My inbox filled with cryptic messages. My phone rang at strange hours, only to deliver silence. Once, I opened my mailbox to find a rosary dripping with what looked like oil and smelling faintly of roses and iron. I attended Mass with different eyes now, watching the altar, listening not just to the homily, but to the silence between the prayers. And I began to notice things. A deacon who never looked at the host. A priest whose shadow moved when he didn't. A sacristan who locked the tabernacle with trembling hands, as if afraid of what it might contain or release. And through it all, the words of the Swiss guard echoed louder, "The sanctuary, the war is in the sanctuary." This was no longer about doctrine. This was about presence. About who and what was really dwelling within the heart of the church. And I feared we were already far deeper into the darkness than anyone was willing to admit. The deeper I went, the more I realized that this wasn't about Bishop Calogero anymore. It was about something underneath the skin of the church, beneath the marble, beneath the incense, beneath the Latin chants that once lulled the world into a sense of divine stability. I couldn't unsee what I had begun to notice. I couldn't unknow the quiet, coordinated war that had already breached the sanctuary. I tried returning to normal life after Sicily, but nothing held. I couldn't focus during interviews. I couldn't stomach most food. Even sleep became a fugitive luxury, interrupted by visions I couldn't explain. The same fig tree from the monastery would return in my dreams, but the branches bled, and in the distance, I always heard Gregorian chant being slowly, cruelly twisted into something dissonant and mechanical. A priest once told me, long ago, that the devil doesn't always scream, sometimes he sings. I think I finally understood what he meant. 2 weeks after my visit with Bishop Calogero, I received another encrypted message. No text this time, just a single video file titled Vir Sanctus Obscurus. I played it cautiously on a burner laptop I'd purchased just for this investigation. The screen flickered and then stabilized into grainy footage of a mass being said in what looked like a subterranean chapel, stone walls, low ceilings, and dim candlelight. I would have dismissed it as just another poorly lit Latin Mass if not for what happened during the elevation of the host. When the priest lifted the consecrated wafer, the camera trembled slightly, as if the air itself was groaning. Behind the altar, in the shadow of the reredos, something flickered. A shape, subtle but there, like a man's outline stretched too thin and tall, arms raised in grotesque imitation. It only lasted a second. But when the priest lowered the host, a single candle behind him extinguished on its own, as if suffocated by an unseen force. The congregation, barely visible, sat motionless. Not in reverence, more like restraint. No one moved. No one breathed. No one even blinked. I shut the laptop and felt an overwhelming urge to go to confession. The Church has long taught that the Mass is a participation in the eternal sacrifice of Christ. But what if, I wondered, the inverse is also true? What if those who oppose that sacrifice have begun mimicking it, hijacking it, not by attacking it from without, but by standing quietly within it, clothed in the vestments of holiness? I reached out to my contacts in Rome, namely, an old friend who worked in the Apostolic Archive. He'd always been a skeptic of conspiracy theories but a lover of puzzles. When I shared what I had, he hesitated, then agreed to meet me in person. We chose a quiet corner of a courtyard cafe not far from the Tiber. He looked older than I remembered, gray in the beard, hollower around the eyes. "You know," he said, sipping espresso without sugar, "there's an unspoken rule here. Not everything the Vatican keeps classified is about politics or abuse scandals. Some files are locked for reasons far older, reasons that precede the papacy itself." I asked him if he believed in demonic infiltration. He didn't answer right away. Then he leaned in, his voice low. "Have you ever heard of the Statio Sanctus Omissus?" I shook my head. "It's a forgotten rite. Suppressed centuries ago. Roughly translates to the station of the absent saints. It was a ritual used in rare cases where clergy were suspected of being under preternatural influence. Not possessed, just hallowed. Their faculties intact, their charm undiminished, but their essence gone. Drained. Replaced." He slid a small flash drive across the table to me. "That's all I can give you. But be careful. These are old ghosts, Matteo. And they don't like being named." That night, I viewed the contents in the dark silence of my hotel room. It contained pages of handwritten Latin notes, apparently scanned from early 18th century church records. Descriptions of priests who celebrated Mass flawlessly but could not recite the creed without trembling. Accounts of bishops who recoiled at holy water, not theatrically, but subtly, as if in mild allergic reaction. And then there were testimonies from lay people who, upon receiving the Eucharist from these men, would fall into weeks of spiritual despair, without understanding why. There was one term that appeared over and over again, clerici nihilati, the hallowed clergy. Was this what Bishop Calogero had seen? Was this what Pope Leo XIV was trying to contain? The idea haunted me. And yet, something still didn't fit. If Leo XIV truly believed in this threat, why operate in such silence? Why not issue a bold proclamation? Why not summon the faithful to vigilance? I thought of the Swiss Guard's words again, "The war won't be in the pews, it'll be in the sanctuary." And then it hit me. If the sanctuary itself is compromised, if even the clergy can no longer be fully trusted, then sounding the alarm might collapse everything. Faith is fragile. If the flock sees the shepherds bleeding from within, many will abandon the pasture entirely. Perhaps silence wasn't cowardice. Perhaps it was triage. Still, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that there was another layer, one final truth I had yet to grasp. My investigation had revealed shadows, symbols, and warnings, but not the core. The why. Why now? Why this sudden purging of bishops? What was coming? I booked one final interview, this time with a former Vatican exorcist turned recluse. His name was Father Donato Greco, and he lived alone in the ruins of an abandoned Franciscan hermitage in Umbria. He had been laicized after publicly accusing a cardinal of concealing a demonically influenced rite. Most dismissed him as mad. But I had run out of people to trust who weren't afraid to speak. When I arrived, he greeted me barefoot and silent, eyes glassy with what I can only describe as fatigue of the soul. He didn't offer tea. He didn't shake my hand. "You're late," he said, and I didn't ask how he knew I was coming. We sat by a fire he'd already lit, though the air was warm. He stared into the flames for a long time before speaking. "You want to know about the removals," he said flatly. I nodded. "They're not removals," he said. "They're evacuations." I blinked. "Evacuations?" He nodded slowly. "The Pope is moving people out of places he knows are about to fall." "Fall to what?" I asked. His voice lowered, almost breaking, to a liturgy that is no longer aimed at heaven. That phrase hit me like ice water. He claimed there were masses now, publicly sanctioned, flawlessly executed, that did not ascend to God. He didn't mean heresy or invalid intention. He meant something deeper, more dangerous. That in certain sanctuaries, the geometry of grace had been subtly inverted. The offering was still made, but not to the Lord of hosts. I asked him what people should do. How should the faithful respond to such a reality? His answer was simple. Watch the candles. If the flame leans toward the altar without wind, leave. I left his hermitage just before dawn. The valley was still cloaked in darkness, but I could feel something stirring in the air. Not fear. Not even dread. Just urgency. Something was coming. Something the Pope was trying to prepare for in silence. I knew then that this story couldn't be an article. It couldn't be a single broadcast or podcast episode. It had to become a chronicle, because history would not believe what was about to unfold. And so I began writing everything. Every file, every interview, every haunted phrase from priests and whistleblowers and mystics. I wrote for 12 hours a day, sleeping in bursts, living off espresso and dread. I knew I had to get ahead of it before the next bishop fell. Before the next sanctuary flickered dark. But even as I wrote, I knew this was only the beginning. It was 2 days after my meeting with Father Donato Greco when the first headline struck the Catholic wire services: Bishop of St. Polten resigns without explanation. The timing was impossible to ignore. Less than 72 hours after I had left that ruined hermitage in Umbria, a bishop in rural Austria known for his progressive stance on synodality and interfaith dialogue had abruptly stepped down. No statement. No health concerns. No scandal. Just a line from the Vatican press office: "The Holy Father has accepted the resignation of His Excellency." I stared at the screen, heart hammering. It was beginning. Not long after, another notice followed, this time from Peru. Then one in southern Germany. And another in Nigeria. It was happening in a rhythm. Not a purge, but something more calculated. Each bishop removed or quietly replaced seemed to align with a map Father Donato had vaguely sketched in our conversation, regions where he said liturgy was about to become theater. The phrase haunted me. Still, no public explanation. No papal speech. No encyclical or apostolic letter. Just silent movements, as if someone were rearranging furniture in a burning house, without telling the tenants the fire had started. I tried to bring it to my editor at La Repubblica, but he waved me off. "We've got bigger stories," he said. "Musk just landed humans on the moon again, and the markets are collapsing. No one cares about bishops getting early retirement packages." He meant well, but I knew something deeper was unfolding, something spiritual, yes, but also systemic. It was a surgery on the church's nervous system while she slept. So I turned to the only platform left, a small, encrypted blog I had once used in college for political satire. I reactivated it and titled the series Domus Vacua, The Empty House. In the first post, I included everything I had uncovered, disguised just enough not to endanger sources. Within hours, traffic surged, then something strange happened. My analytics showed significant activity from Vatican servers. Someone was reading. And then, an anonymous email landed in my inbox. No text. Just a subject line, "You are not alone. Meet me where the river bends near the obelisk." That was how I found myself, on a cold Tuesday morning, under the Ponte San Angelo with a man who would only give me a code name, Raphael. He wore civilian clothes but spoke with the quiet, clipped syntax of a man used to secrets. His face was hard to place, middle-aged, Mediterranean, perhaps former clergy. "I work inside the Congregation for Bishops," he said. "I won't stay long. You're getting too close," and they started watching. "Who is they?" I asked. He glanced up toward the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, only partially visible through the mist. "The ones who have remained in the Church's highest offices but no longer serve her true mission." "Are you talking about Freemasons?" I asked, half joking. He didn't smile. "Worse," he said. "They believe they are reformers. In reality, they are technicians of inversion." I didn't understand at first, so he elaborated. "There's a new movement inside the Curia. It's not officially named, but it moves in committees, document edits, episcopal suggestions. Their goal is not to destroy the Church, that would be obvious. Their goal is to recode her from within. Same vestments, same hymns, but the orientation, adversum Deum, away from God." I asked how far it had spread. Raphael didn't hesitate. "Far enough that Pope Leo is no longer acting from strength. He is acting from time. He's trying to outrun the inevitable. Removing bishops before they are replaced with something synthetic." That word chilled me. Synthetic? Yes. Men who appear priestly, sound holy, quote the saints, but their sacraments are empty. Not invalid, necessarily. Just evacuated of grace. They know how to mimic the divine while sterilizing its power. He handed me a thin packet of paper. It was a list, names, dates, dioceses, and cryptic annotations like compromised but resistant or fully reoriented. Observe. "These are the next likely targets," he whispered. "Not for removal, but for subversion. You'll see changes in their tone. Their writings will begin to echo the same motifs: unity above truth, inclusion above repentance, earth over eternity." I thanked him. He turned and disappeared down a corridor I hadn't noticed before, vanishing into the murk like a ghost. I spent the next few days reading the packet, cross-referencing the names with past homilies, Twitter posts, synodal speeches. And sure enough, I began to see it. A shift in tone, so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't looking. Phrases like sacred diversity replacing moral clarity. talks on ecological theology drowning out confessions of sin and repentance. And everywhere, an undercurrent of liturgical neutrality, as if the Eucharist were a symbol rather than a person. Then I remembered something Bishop Calogero had said to me in Sicily: there are some who no longer kneel, not out of pride, but because they no longer recognize what stands before them. It became clear that Pope Leo XIV wasn't just reacting. He was buying time. He was trying to cut off the infection before it reached the spinal cord. But time, I feared, was almost gone. The blog posts became more frequent. I posted excerpts of the handwritten liturgical records I had scanned from Father Donato. I even translated parts of the Statio Sanctus Omissus right into English, careful to redact the more disturbing elements. I received messages from readers, priests, nuns, laypeople, all confirming they, too, felt something was off. One wrote, "Our parish recently introduced a Eucharistic circle where the host is passed hand to hand while everyone says their personal truth aloud. My soul recoiled. I went home and wept." Another said, "My bishop now speaks only of inclusion, never of the cross. We are being fed compassion without conversion. It tastes sweet, but something in it feels poisoned." I compiled the testimonies into a document I called Lex Mundi Fracta, the broken law of the world. By the end of the week, the document had gone viral in underground Catholic circles. It reached Latin America, Poland, the Philippines. Even a retired African cardinal commented anonymously, saying only, "Truth hidden still echoes." But with the spread came threat. My apartment was broken into. My hard drives were copied. A man in a cassock began appearing at the back of the churches I attended. He never approached me, just watched. Still, I pressed on. Because deep down, I had begun to believe something terrifying, yet sacred. This wasn't just a bureaucratic purge. This wasn't even about corruption. This was a final sorting. The wheat and the tares. The hollow and the holy. Pope Leo XIV knew this. That's why he had acted so suddenly, so silently. That's why he had removed the bishop from Newark. Not because the man was evil, but because his post had become the battleground. And there were others. Many more. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the lightning had already struck. The rain in Rome had a strange rhythm that weak, intermittent and hard, like some unseen hand was wringing out the sky in anger or grief. My nerves were stretched thin. Even my reflection in the window of the cafe on Via del Mascherino looked unfamiliar, older, wearier, eyes that had seen too much and still hungered for what was hidden. I hadn't slept properly in days. The dreams were back, more vivid than ever. Fire sweeping through a cathedral. A chalice overflowing with ink. A bishop kneeling beneath a blood moon whispering, "He comes clothed in light." That morning, I had arranged a meeting with someone who signed their email simply as Miriam. No other details. No phone number. Just an encrypted message. I was there in Newark. I saw why he was removed. Meet me under the bronze statue of St. Michael on the Tiber Bridge. When I arrived, she was already there. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, wrapped in a gray shawl that fluttered slightly in the wind. Her eyes locked on mine, firm but not unkind. "You're Matteo," she said softly, confirming without asking. Walk with me." We moved slowly down the bridge. The Tiber below flowed muddy and heavy, like a river carrying secrets too old to name. "I was the personal assistant to Bishop Alonso of Newark," she said without ceremony. "I typed his statements, canceled his appointments, filtered his mail." I hesitated before replying, unsure if she had come to defend him or to expose something else. "He wasn't a bad man," she continued, "but he had become tired, spiritually thin. He no longer believed in resistance, not against what was coming." She reached into her coat and handed me a folded letter, handwritten, dated May 20th, just 10 days before his removal. "I am surrounded by voices that do not belong to Christ. They speak of unity, yes, but it is a unity forged without the cross. I fear I have already compromised by silence. If I speak now, I may be removed. If I do not, I betray him. Lord, forgive me." I closed my eyes. The handwriting was unmistakably his, tight, looping cursive I recognized from his public statements. He wrote that the night after receiving a delegation from Rome, Miriam said, they brought him an invitation to participate in a pilot liturgical program. It replaced the creed with personal affirmations and emphasized the primacy of human dignity above dogma. I clenched the paper, already knowing what came next. He refused. "Yes," she replied. And within days, he was gone. She stopped at the edge of the bridge and turned to face me fully. "But listen," she said. "The new bishop, Bishop Gaius, is not what he seems." I raised an eyebrow. I had already read Bishop Gaius' public statements. Measured, theologically sound, even beautiful in places. "His words are true," she continued, "but there's no presence in them. No anointing. He smiles but doesn't listen. He preaches repentance but knows nothing of mercy. The poor avoid him instinctively." I understood what she meant. I had met such men before, orthodox in form, but hollow at the core. Vessels emptied of fire. "I think," she said quietly, "he is what they are trying to replicate. The new model." We stood in silence for a moment, the wind cutting between us. "They're not just removing bishops," I said slowly. "They're replacing them with something engineered. Men who appear holy, but function more like guardians of a new order." She nodded, lips tight. "Men who will not recognize the bridegroom when he knocks." I thanked her. She turned and disappeared into the shadows beneath Castel Sant'Angelo, leaving me with the letter and a mounting sense of dread. That evening, I returned to my apartment to find my front door ajar. Everything was intact, except my journals. Gone. Notebooks filled with interviews, notes, timelines, and scribbled prayers. Years of work. And more disturbingly, nothing else was touched. No theft. No damage. Just silence. It was a message. I sat on the floor, letter from Bishop Alonso in one hand, a crucifix in the other, and wept. But the next morning, I began again. Because now I knew that this wasn't just a story about the Vatican. This wasn't even about Pope Leo XIV or his reshuffling of bishops. This was a spiritual coup. A new ecclesiology was rising, not from synods or councils, but from the infiltration of subtle heresies wrapped in pastoral language. Words like inclusion, accompaniment, and dialogue had become weapons, unsuspecting believers lulled into sleep by songs of welcome that never mentioned the cross. I began contacting those still faithful. Bishops in hiding. Monasteries untouched by the new liturgy. Laity who prayed in barns and basements because their churches had been emptied of the real presence. And everywhere I turned, I saw it, the same pattern. Faithful remnant. Strange silence. Spiritual tension. And the quiet conviction that something was coming soon. One night, while sifting through saved messages, I noticed a short encrypted note buried in old correspondence. It had been sent months earlier from an anonymous account I had long dismissed. All it said was, "Rome must fall before Jerusalem can rise again. Watch the West. Watch Leo. The harvest nears." I didn't know what it meant then, but I would soon. Because the next removal wasn't in Newark or Nigeria. It was in Rome. And it was coming fast. The heat that June in Rome was unnatural. Even the wind that swept through the colonnades of St. Peter's Square carried with it no relief, only the heavy scent of something about to break. I had been tracing shadows for months, names whispered, letters buried, bishops silenced. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. It began not with fire or fanfare, but with a headline buried beneath the noise of global headlines. The Vatican quietly announced the reassignment of Cardinal De Luca, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. No public explanation. No farewell Massachusetts. No statement from Pope Leo XIV. The man who replaced him was Bishop Gaius, the very same who had taken over the Diocese of Newark. He was now a cardinal, consecrated in a private ceremony, sworn in behind closed doors. Just like that, one of the most powerful theological positions in the Church had passed into the hands of someone I knew to be other. Rome buzzed with unease. The silence from the Holy Father was suffocating. Priests I once knew to be loyal to Christ spoke now of reconstruction, of a post-traditional ecclesiology that would liberate the faithful from guilt and doctrine. The sacraments were being revised quietly. No longer sins to confess, just spiritual misalignments. Eucharistic prayers shortened. The creed replaced in some places with vague affirmations of universal love. I went to one of the last parishes untouched, Santa Maria del Grazie, tucked in a back alley of Trastevere. There, a priest named Father Lucian still said the Latin Massachusetts. He welcomed me, eyes hollow but voice firm. "They are removing the anchors," he whispered as he handed me a folded parchment. "After Massachusetts, we are being unmoored." The parchment was a letter. Sealed. Addressed not to me, but to Pope Leo XIV himself. "Your Holiness," it began, "I write not as a rebel, but as a servant. I plead that you remember your vow before the altar of God, that you would feed the sheep, not experiment upon them. What you remove, heaven will restore. What you hide, heaven will shout. What you silence, the martyrs will echo in blood." It was signed, Bishop Juan Ramirez, Archdiocese of Buenos Aires. I had heard whispers of him, one of the last bishops resisting from within South America. He had not been seen publicly in months. The next day, news came that Ramirez had resigned voluntarily. but I no longer believed in coincidences. I made a decision then. I would no longer just observe. I would speak. I drafted an open letter to the church, releasing everything I had: testimonies, leaked documents, encrypted emails, and eyewitness accounts. I titled it, "Letters to the Remnant, a Watchman's Cry from Within Rome." I expected backlash. What I received was far more chilling. 3 nights after publication, as I returned home from evening mass, I found my apartment door wide open. No theft. No mess. Just a single item placed in the center of my desk. A bishop's crozier. Snapped in two. I understood. It wasn't just a threat. It was a prophecy. The shepherds would be broken before the sheep. But that same night, I received hundreds of messages, priests, lay people, even nuns, thanking me, confirming the same patterns in their countries. France, Canada, Brazil, the Philippines. The remnant was real and growing. I was not alone anymore. Weeks passed. Pope Leo XIV remained silent, his public appearances reduced to papal tweets and pre-recorded messages. When he did speak, his tone was eerily neutral, neither joy nor warning. Just words. Cold. Calculated. Lacking spirit. But then, on October 13th, 2025, everything shifted. During what should have been a routine Sunday Angelus, the Pope's address was interrupted mid-broadcast. The live stream glitched. The feed cut to black. And in that moment of silence, a new voice took hold, not in audio, but in spirit. Across the globe, faithful believers reported visions, dreams, and spontaneous weeping during that blackout moment. One priest in India claimed he saw the Archangel Michael standing on the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, sword drawn, proclaiming, "The time has come. The house will be shaken. Let the faithful hold fast." In a convent in Poland, 5 cloistered nuns reported receiving the same prophetic word. He who ascends without the Spirit will fall. Watch for the fire in the tower. And here in Rome, I felt it too. Not in sight or sound, but in my bones. The reckoning had begun. Within days, anonymous Vatican sources began leaking documents implicating top officials in widespread spiritual manipulation campaigns, rewriting catechisms, misusing AI-generated homilies, and even experimenting with digital confessionals that erase penance altogether. And then, on All Saints' Day, something even more shocking happened. Pope Leo XIV vanished. No announcement. No abdication. The papal apartments were sealed. A single note left behind in his study. I have seen what cannot be unseen. I have heard what will not be unheard. May Christ have mercy on his servant. He was never found. The conclave that followed was like none before. Not a gathering of cardinals for political maneuvering, but a desperate assembly of souls seeking spiritual clarity. The Vatican was split. 2 groups emerged. One demanded continuity, a papacy guided by the technological future. The other bent the knee. And from that remnant, a new voice rose. Cardinal Raymond Adoma of Nigeria, elected by unanimous remnant consensus. a man known for quiet holiness, deep prayer, and fierce fidelity to Christ. He took the name Pope Benedict XVII. His first words from the balcony were not a blessing. They were a battle cry. To all who have ears, return. Rebuild. Resist. The gates of hell shall not prevail. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in sobs. Rome wept with relief. And I, Matteo Bellini, stood in the shadows of the square, heart pounding, cross in hand, and whispered a vow. I will watch until the end. I will write what I see. For the bride must know when the bridegroom nears. If this story stirred something in you, if you see shadows in the light or sense the Spirit calling you deeper, go to the comments and write. I will not sleep through the shaking. Let your voice join the remnant. Let the world know you're awake.